First up is Anna, and there's a question about, first of all, seeing your shadow preview. So if I hit, 7, I'm in lit mode, so like 5 is shaded, 6 is textured, 7 is lit, so I can see the effect of the light on the objects here. To see that shadow under lighting, you can turn shadows on and off here and see your shadow. The other question was that the shadow was casting onto the sky, and one thing you can do is if I select this surface and I go to the attribute editor and go to render stats, you can turn off receives shadows, and then it won't receive a shadow onto it, that particular surface you have selected when you deselect that. So that's one way to avoid that showing up on your sky. Yeah, so besides the shadow being cast on the sky, this is looking good. You could try different angles of the sunlight. It's nice when there's a little bit of shadow cast on the ground, kind of like you have on this one, I guess, to kind of give it, just place the building on the ground a little bit more, but it looks good. Yeah, that's a really nice composition with the character in the foreground, the sort of framing you have here. Shows off your building nicely. And another good image, yeah, very well composed. I really like the foreground objects you've got here, and really gives it some depth. So yeah, that looks good. Nice work. Next up is George, and yeah, it looks very good. You didn't get the cast shadows in, and you mentioned you had some problem with ray tracing crashing Maya. I guess if you send me the file, I can take a look. It's sort of hard to guess. One thing you can try that sometimes solves problems is file optimize scene size options, and then just turn everything on here, and then optimize, and then save as something else like a numbered version of a file, and sometimes that cleans up some issues. But yeah, without me kind of looking at the file, it's really hard to know why it might be crashing. This image has a nice foreground object. So yeah, foreground objects are always good, and it kind of frames the image, and it's overall nice composition, good lighting. But yeah, cast shadows will be helpful, but obviously you had that rendering problem. Yeah, also looks good. I think the kind of the lack of detail on the roof, not that I would expect you to put the detail on the roof, but it sort of makes this image not as great, but the building looks really good in the shot, and the texture is nice. And yeah, I might have gotten a little closer to some of these elements just because all this very blank ground kind of filling up the frame. If there was some kind of texture detail here, this would work better, but it looks, it's like 50% of the frame is just a solid color. So I might kind of push in a little bit on this one, but it's still pretty good composition. So yeah, and you got it working. It's good. Next up is Deontay, and yeah, this is looking good. I would say to go a little brighter, maybe. Um, if it's a clear sky without any clouds, so you assume it's a pretty sunny day, and so you'd see a pretty high contrast between the brightness on the ground and the shadow areas. So I would go a little brighter, and let the shadows be a little darker for that. But the composition is good. Again, as I said before, use of foreground objects. It's a good idea. And the building's looking really nice in its spot here. Yeah, a nice use of this character in the foreground. It looks good. It's good work. I guess, yeah, you got some cast shadows, it looks like, so that's good. Next up is Clive, and yeah, this is looking good. Nice angle on the building, and you got the hills in the background, which help, and some foreground objects, and looks like you got some cast shadows, which looks nice. Yeah, I like that you've experimented here with the nighttime look. I think that's working pretty well. I can't tell what this is in the foreground here, so it looks kind of strange, so I might try something a little different there. And again, yeah, this looks good. Maybe angling the light a little bit differently, just because the way these, like, everything's sort of so straight according to the angle of the street. Not to say that that's not possible, but I think just, the composition might be more interesting if you had some shadows at kind of an angle rather than sort of straight down the street. But overall, it's looking good. Next up is J-Min, and yeah, it's looking pretty good. You got some texture on the front of this, which I think helps, along with these additional props. Yeah, and I like the character in the foreground. I might have gone with a different texture along that surface from the rest of the front, but that's alright. And yeah, I think what this shot really needs is some cast shadows. I think it kind of just really helps place the objects on the screen, and there's a way in which the objects look like they're just sort of floating there without the shadows, so it would be really good to get your shadows working. And yeah, same thing for this one. Again, I could really use some shadows, just do things like help place these wagon wheels on the ground and so forth. So and the base of this and all that kind of stuff. Anything touching the ground looks more like it's on the ground when you have cast shadows, so try to get that working. Next up is Jersey, and I'm just wondering, it's weird that the image looks sort of aliased like this. I'm wondering if maybe you need to turn your render quality up or something, or it almost just looks like a screen snapshot to me as opposed to a render. Also, there's no shadows or cast shadows, I don't think. Although maybe there is there. Maybe that's depth map shadows, I'm not sure. But either way, that we shouldn't look quite so aliased on the edges there. And then same here, it's like we've got these vague, I guess you do have cast shadows there. But maybe you're using depth map shadows with a lot of blur or something rather than ray trace shadows. It's hard to know by just looking at the image for sure. These buildings look a little washed out there, whereas this one looks very saturated. So next to each other, that looks a little strange. Yeah, so I think getting sort of sharper shadows, getting a little bit of a cleaner render would improve it. I'll just make sure if you are using my software render, that you're on production quality. And if you want, the real sharp shadows, you can use ray trace shadows. Next up is Chavis, and yeah, as others mentioned, good job on the textures, but also as others mentioned, you're going to want to have brighter lights. It's just very dark. I can show you sort of a trick with the background image that might be interesting to you. So if I have a background image, so I'm just going to right mouse click, assign new material. I'll use just like a Lambert, and if I map it to the color of the object, file, and I'm just going to grab an image I downloaded off my desktop. Don't ever put your stuff on the desktop, put in your source images directory. But you can already tell the brightness of that image reacts to this light. Like if the light's more pointed at it and it's brighter, and if it's pointed away it's darker, and same thing if I render it, same problem. It's not as bright as the source original image. So what you can do instead is go back to this Lambert. I'm just going to right mouse click, break connection, and instead of mapping it to the color, I can map it to the incandescence. So you can either do that the same way you map the color file, or if I'm in the hypershade, I just did hotbox, click in the southern marking menu, went over to hypershade to get that. And if I go under textures, here's my file, and I can just middle mouse drag that right to incandescence. Now if I go 6, I can see that 7. Now right now it looks kind of too bright, and you can see in this view it seems like it's still affected by the light, and it is still affected by the light. But what we can do is we can break the light length with this. So I can select the light and the surface and go to rendering, lighting, shading, and then break light lengths. So now this light isn't lighting that object, but it won't work in this preview. It still looks like, this preview view doesn't recognize light linking. So but if I render it now, what you see is it's the exact brightness of the original image because it's on an incandescent map and there's no light lighting it. So you'd want to break any lights in the scene from lighting it, and then it'll have exactly the color. So you want no lights lighting it, and it's sort of like lit by the image itself. And that's a nice way to do a background image and just getting it even. So, especially if it's round, you might get brighter areas or darker areas. But if you use an incandescence map and break light links to any light, you'll get precisely the brightnesses of the original source image. So that technique would have been useful for this background. Um, Again, very nice textures here, but again, very, very dark. So yeah, just either additional light or change the angle of your light or increase the intensity of your light. This one looks a little bit better, but again, this part's really, really, really dark. So, and also your image got very stretched here. I'm wondering why that's the case. If it's on a sphere, that might happen. So, might want to do that a little differently. But yeah, good textures, but yeah, lighting could have been improved. And I don't really see if there's any cast shadows or not. It's very hard to tell, but right now it looks like there isn't, I don't think. So it'd be better if there were some cast shadows. Hi, this is Leo, and I'm trying to understand your question. You said you imported reference for the town that had the bank, and I tried to make the layer invisible. I'm not sure which layer you mean. And then it didn't disappear, and if I'm in Maya and I make a layer invisible, it makes that thing disappear. So not sure which one you're having trouble with, but if you do have some issue, you could always make a new layer or something. Like you've got a couple things on top of each other here. Like let's say you wanted to make this one disappear and I can't find a layer for it, I could just click this button, create a new layer, and assign selected objects, and just hide that layer and make that disappear. So maybe that's helpful to you. So yeah, this is looking okay. Not sure what these gray things are. Makes me think there's like two surfaces on top of each other or something. I think you could do with a little bit more contrasty lighting and having some kind of light areas and more shadow areas, which for a more sunlit day look. And again, it'd really be helpful to have some cast shadows on the ground, which you don't have right now. So making sure you're rendering with cast shadows. And so I would say try and figure out what these gray things are. Double check that the ground isn't doubled up, and then maybe somewhat brighter lights and then darker shadow areas and cast shadows would all really help. Next is Romello, and yeah, it's good. You got a texture on there. I mentioned before the boards are too wide, but that hasn't changed. But maybe a little bit too contrasty of a texture, although the wood looks a little intensely bumpy. So you might want to tone that down a little bit. Okay, and here it is without the texture, and you're going to want to render with cast shadows. So try to get some shadows going. And yeah, also I would work on the scale. This looks very small. Like look at the size of this door. It's as big as kind of the whole building. So I think this would scale up a lot to fit in the town. And yeah, I might try to do some compositions where it include a little bit more of the town just to kind of get a sense of the place with this as well. And then yeah, lighting with cast shadows. Ramel also did this extra thing, which is fun. Cool. Next up is Basha, and yeah, it looks alright. I think you went maybe a little too kind of reddish on the light. Everything's looking a little bit pink, so maybe I might just tone that down a little bit. And sometimes it can help if you hit things from the other angle with like a bluer light for some contrast. Also, you really want cast shadows, and you really want to get like a higher quality renders where you don't get all this kind of artifacting here. All these little dots look a little distracting. So yeah, same points here, and I think getting some cast shadows would really help with this as well. It looks like, I don't know if that's like the line of some weird shadow or if that's something else. But either way, you want the shadow of the buildings cast onto the street, onto the ground. I think the composition of this one is interesting, so that's good. But again, same issues with sort of some of the render quality stuff, and getting some cast shadows in would really improve it. Next up is Xana, and yeah, said she was having a couple of problems with the scene file. If you send me the scene file, I can take a look. Um, Something weird going on with these columns here. Be curious to figure out what that is. These little strange marks here and at the bottom. Yeah, you'll want to just get shadows going on and maybe improve the render quality so you don't see this sort of aliasing here on some of these areas. And yeah, the ground really feels like it's calling out for some cast shadows because you have this very large field of just solid color, um, which make things look like they're a little floating kind of. So yeah, that's the main thing is adjust the lighting, get cast shadows. I'd want to troubleshoot these columns, but if you send me the scene file, I can take a look at that. Next up is Melissa, and yeah, looking good. Kind of unique point of view, and you've got some decent looking textures on here. Yeah, and you've got the lighting with the cast shadows going on, although there's some sort of strange shapes. I'm just wondering, maybe it's from the angle, the light there, but yeah, this looks interesting. And I like all the signs. You did all the textured signs on the building, so that's good. Yeah, I might try to do something to get some sort of foreground objects in here to help give this a little bit of depth. Also, when I'm looking at this compared to the neighboring building here, this one looks scaled up a little bit too big to me. Not sure. Yeah, it was a little bit hard to tell in some of these other points of view, but make sure its relative size works with the rest of the buildings. Maybe I'm mistaken. It's hard to tell. It sort of depends on the angle. But that looks kind of small compared to that to me. Anyway, overall it's good work, good textures, the lighting works. Got some odd shapes here, so I might try with like a different angle of light just to maybe lose some of the unusual shadow shapes. Looks like you had an issue getting the various objects into the town. I think there's a file called like the town or something like that you can open that already has all the buildings in, so you might want to try working with that file instead. So yeah, I mean, I would call this a little bit incomplete. Besides not having the buildings in, you don't have any kind of lighting with any direction to it or any shadows. So I would take another pass at this and then resubmit it once you've got all the town together and have some better lighting in there.